6 bodies, buried beneath the floors of 2 houses, one in Lancashire, one in Melbourne, all sealed under cement, poured by the same pair of hands. The man who mixed it attended his own wedding the morning after murdering his wife and 4 children. Rainhill, Lancashire, 1891. A respectable parish, a quiet street, a rented villa called Deeming, where neighbors heard children laughing one week and silence the next. He told them his sister had gone abroad. No forwarding address, no farewell. Nobody looked beneath the kitchen floor. Nobody looked for 7 months. But here is what has never sat right with me, and what the history books conveniently pass over in haste. This man was known to the law, known to the courts, known in 3 countries as a swindler, a bigamist, a blackguard who owed every tradesman in every town he ever graced with his presence. And yet, not one constable, not one magistrate, not one soul in authority ever looked at him closely enough to see what he truly was. Tonight, we ask why. By the time this investigation is done, you will understand not just how Frederick Deeming murdered 6 people across 2 continents, but how a Victorian society obsessed with respectability, appearances, and the proper order of things allowed him to do it. You will understand the Scotland Yard file that suggested he may have been Jack the Ripper, and why the Metropolitan Police buried that theory faster than Deeming buried his victims. And you will understand the uncomfortable truth about what it means when a man is tried by the newspapers before he ever sets foot in a dock. Welcome to Cemented in Lies. Frederick Bailey Deeming was born in Ashby-de-la-Zouch, Leicestershire, in the summer of 1853. The youngest of 7 children to a tinsmith father who would die insane in a workhouse, having attempted to slash his own throat on 4 occasions. They called young Frederick Mad Fred in the neighborhood. Not as a joke, as a warning. At 16, he ran off to sea. And what the sea gave him was something far more dangerous than adventure. It gave him distance, it gave him aliases, and it gave him the understanding that a man can be whoever he needs to be in whatever port he washes up. He was a hard-faced man with a ginger mustache and blue eyes. He had an engaging way with words. You believed him. That was the rum affair of it. You always believed him. He had been galled for larceny in Sydney, declared bankrupt in Melbourne, prosecuted for fraud in South Africa. By 1891, the debts had grown too heavy. The aliases too many, the family, a living inconvenience, something was going to give. The summer of 1891, Deeming arrived in Rainhill, Lancashire, under the name of Albert Oliver Williams, Army Inspector, son of a colonel, a man of considerable means who was expecting his employer to join him shortly from India. The colonel, of course, never arrived. He did not exist, but Williams did. And Williams had charm in spades. He took lodgings at the Commercial Hotel. Each evening he held court at the bar, spinning yarns of his travels. Australia, South Africa, the Orient. He spent freely. He tipped generously. He was, by all accounts, right proper company. His landlady's daughter, Emily Mather, was 26 years old, bright-eyed. Quite taken with this worldly, distinguished lodger, he proposed within weeks. The Liverpool Mercury, September 1891. A most lavish celebration. Mr. A.O. Williams, lately of the Indian Army, celebrated his union with Miss Emily Mather of Rainhill with a banquet of considerable splendor. The happy couple depart shortly for their new life in the Australian colonies. But here is what the Mercury did not print, because here is what the Mercury did not know. 3 days before that lavish wedding banquet, an exhausted woman arrived at Deeming Villa with 4 small children in tow. She had not been invited. Her name was Marie. She was Frederick Deeming's first wife, and she had come from Birkenhead because the man she knew as her husband had promised to send for her. He told the neighbors she was his sister, visiting for a spell, nothing to worry about. Within days, the children fell silent, and on the 26th of July, 1891, Frederick Deeming murdered Marie and all 4 of his children as they slept. He struck them with a hammer. He cut their throats. Then, methodically, with the patience of a man who had clearly considered this at length, he pulled up the kitchen floorboards, laid the bodies beneath, sprinkled chloride of lime to mask the odor, and poured cement. He supervised the workmen who relaid the floor himself. 3 weeks later, he married Emily Mather in St. Anne's Church, Rainhill. Blimey, the nerve of the man. They sailed for Melbourne aboard the Kaiser Wilhelm II in November. Deeming told Emily they were starting fresh. A new life, a new country, and somewhere in the North Atlantic. Here is the question that Scotland Yard would later find themselves unable to answer cleanly. In the autumn of 1888, 3 years earlier, at least 5 women had been murdered in London's Whitechapel. Eviscerated, throats slashed, the work of someone who knew how to use a blade. Frederick Deeming's whereabouts in the autumn of 1888 have never been fully accounted for. Melbourne, December 1891. The couple arrived under the name of Druin. Deeming rented a small brick cottage at 57 Andrew Street in the suburb of Windsor. He was charming with the neighbors, ostentatious, always generous with other people's money. He spoke of his new wife with apparent devotion. On Christmas Eve, 1891, he battered Emily Mather around the skull with an axe handle, cut her throat, and buried her beneath the bedroom hearthstone. He had purchased the cement a week prior. In her name, as it happened, the man planned everything except his own ego, because Deeming could not resist being noticed. Within days of murdering his wife, he was at a Melbourne jewelry shop selling stolen rings. He was corresponding with a matrimonial agency under yet another name. He was on a steamer to Sydney, where he introduced himself to a 22-year-old English woman named Kate Rouncewell as Baron Swanston, an engineer of some distinction, seeking a wife for the very first time. I had no reason to doubt him. He was the most attentive of men. He spoke of his estates in Western Australia. He gave me jewelry. I was quite enchanted, I believe. I believe I was to be the next one cemented into a floor. When my sister telegraphed me, she said only 4 words: "For God's sake, stop!" Kate fainted when she saw the newspaper stand in Melbourne. Detectives were waiting in her hotel room when she came to. Back in Windsor, a new tenant had complained of a disagreeable smell in the 2nd bedroom. The estate agent raised the hearthstone. Emily Mather was found on the 3rd of March, 1892. Skull fractured, throat cut, sealed beneath 2 inches of cement. The investigation that followed was remarkably swift. Detectives Considine and Causey of the Victorian police traced Deeming through passenger manifests. They had a name within a week. They had him in irons within 8 days of finding the body. He was arrested at Southern Cross, a goldfields town in Western Australia, calling himself Baron Swanston, a barrel of cement already purchased for the home he was preparing for Kate Rouncewell. When the constable placed the handcuffs on his wrists, Deeming said calmly, "I shall say nothing. I am innocent. I have never been to Windsor to the best of my knowledge." He paused. "My name is not Williams," the constable replied. "I can't help that." By the time Deeming arrived back in Melbourne on the 1st of April, 1892, the city had gone somewhat mad. Melbourne Evening Standard, April 1892. Deeming, the Jack the Ripper of the Southern Seas. Could the greatest criminal of the century be identical with the Whitechapel fiend? The body hacked and mangled, the cool manner in which the cementing was carried out. All these things suggest the malevolence and craft which can scarcely accompany the sane murderer. The press had made up its mind before a single piece of evidence was tested in court. Postcards were printed. Pamphlets sold outside Melbourne Gaol. a stage play, willful murder, performed while Deeming was still awaiting trial. 12,000 people had already subscribed to the view that he was guilty. The jury had not yet been empaneled. And now, the Ripper question. Let us examine this properly, not as sensation, as evidence. The Whitechapel murders occurred between August and November 1888. At the time, the Metropolitan Police officially placed Deeming either in Gaol or in South Africa. But forensic researcher and former Metropolitan Police detective Robin Napper spent years revisiting the timeline. His team's conclusion was troubling. His method of killing, the throat, the blade, was consistent. His profession as a gasfitter gave him knowledge of London's back streets and sewers. His ability to vanish behind a different name in a different city was, by 1888, already well practiced. And his death mask, displayed for decades at the Black Museum of New Scotland Yard, was labeled quite deliberately as that of Jack the Ripper, not a suspect, not a person of interest. The Ripper. The Crime Museum's past display of Deeming's death mask as Jack the Ripper tells us something. The police were not merely speculating. The label suggests that at some level within the institution, the file had been quietly closed. And yet, officially, the Metropolitan Police dismissed it. The file was buried. The dates were said to be incompatible, and the establishment of two nations, Britain and Australia, needed a verdict that was clean, swift, and definitive, not one that reopened the most infamous unsolved case in Victorian criminal history. Which brings us to the trial, and to the single most uncomfortable question of this entire case. Could Frederick Deeming, a man whose father died insane, whose brother was confined to a lunatic asylum, who suffered epileptic fits witnessed on the very train that carried him to Melbourne, could this man have received a fair trial? His defense counsel was Alfred Deakin, not yet the Prime Minister of Australia, but already one of the most formidable legal minds in the colonies. Deakin believed Deeming was genuinely insane. He had expert witnesses, two doctors, prepared to testify to the epilepsy, the hereditary mental instability, the seizures observed during transport. He requested a month's adjournment so that the frenzy might abate. He was granted 1 week. My lord, the newspapers of this colony have tried and condemned my client before a single sworn word has been uttered in this room. I submit that no jury drawn from Melbourne can approach this matter with the presumption of innocence to which every man in the British Empire is entitled. Your application for adjournment is refused, Mr. Deakin. The trial will proceed. The jury listened well to the yarn I had to tell, but they sent me straight to hell. The psychiatric evidence was, by the court's assessment, inadequately presented. The jury deliberated for barely an hour. Guilty. And here is where the revelation sits, not in the verdict, but in what came after it. Deeming's legal team requested that, following execution, his brain be removed and examined for neurological abnormality. If there was evidence of epilepsy-driven homicidal mania, a recognized condition in Victorian medical literature, it would, at the very least, have raised serious questions about the court's rejection of the insanity defense. The government refused, repeatedly. Doctors and waxwork artists were permitted to make plaster casts of his skull. His death mask was taken. Copies of his portrait sold outside the prison like music hall programs. But the brain, the one piece of evidence that might have vindicated, or at least complicated, the entire case, was destroyed with the body. The autobiography Deeming wrote in his final weeks, the one that might have answered whether he truly believed his dead mother's spirit was urging him to kill, was destroyed at the request of his family. Everything that might have complicated the narrative was quietly, efficiently removed. The open loop has never been cleanly closed. It was simply buried, much like his victims. And that should unsettle us considerably more than the murders themselves. On the morning of the 23rd of May, 1892, Frederick Bailey Deeming was hanged at Melbourne Gaol at 10 minutes past 10. Outside the prison walls, an estimated 10,000 people gathered, possibly more. When the black flag was raised above the Gaol house to signal that the sentence had been carried out, the crowd cheered. 12,000 souls, the records tell us, celebrating in the streets, in the colonies, in England, in the pages of the New York Times. The world exhaled. Emily Mather's monument was erected at Melbourne General Cemetery by public subscription. It reads, in part, "Beloved daughter of John and Dove Mather of Rainhill, England, murdered 24th December 1891 at Windsor, Melbourne, aged 26 years. There is no monument for Marie Deeming. There is no monument for Bertha, or young Marie, or Sydney Francis, or Lilla, 18 months old, her throat cut in a Lancashire kitchen. Their names appear in the record, and then, largely, they disappear from it. He was a most passionate man, and when out of temper had no control over himself. I have watched him. I have seen the change come over his eyes. Whatever he was, and I do not excuse him, he was not entirely the man the newspapers described. They wanted a monster, and so a monster is what they made. Deeming spent his final days writing poetry. He requested to speak with Church of England ministers. His last verse, scratched out in pencil in a Melbourne Gaol cell, the jury listened well to the yarn I had to tell, but they sent me straight to hell. If this case has stirred something in you, if you believe forgotten crimes deserve to be remembered, subscribe to Victorian Dark Mysteries. A new investigation drops every week. And if you've made it this far, you already know this channel is different. Here is what Deeming's case truly tells us. Not about a man, about a system. Victorian England and her colonies operated on the understanding that respectability was visible, that a man's virtue could be read in his collar, his diction, his club membership. That charm was a signifier of character. Frederick Deeming understood this better than the system did. He walked through its categories: army inspector, mining engineer, baron, colonel's son, and it opened every door. The creditors believed him, the landlords believed him, the churches married him, the women loved him, because he wore respectability like a costume, and a society built on appearances couldn't tell the difference. And when it was over, when the bodies were dug out of 2 floors on 2 continents, the very system that had enabled him needed the story to be simple: a monster, a madman, an aberration, something that couldn't happen again because it couldn't be explained. So the brain was refused. The autobiography was burned. The Ripper file was sealed. And the Mather children were given a monument, while Marie's children were given silence. In the spring of 1892, a Melbourne newspaper ran the headline, "The Criminal of the Century," and perhaps they were right. But the criminal of the century didn't work alone. He had considerable assistance from a world that mistook a fine suit and a steady gaze for an honest man. Cor blimey, do we all.